Rogue Logic. This is the way.
Hello everyone, welcome to Rogue Logic, and this is part 2 of my videos of 3 on beginning collecting comics, or Collecting Comics 101 for beginners. Part 1, if you didn't see it, please refer to that one first. That pretty much covered the different eras of comic books and a little bit of an introduction into the origin of comic books. Nothing too detailed, as this is basically just for people just getting started out. So let me get to the next section, which is going to be mostly involved with proper storage of comic books, and later on we'll probably speak more about some strategies for selling, if that is your intention. All right, let's get into it. Hello again, everyone. I did want to make a couple quick clarifications before we move on to part 2 of Comic Book Collecting 101, basically for beginners. Going back to part 1, the eras of different eras of comic books. There are a couple clarifications that I just want to put in here, just so there's no confusion. Now, the pre-Golden Age that I had spoken about in part 1, beginning with Action Comics number 1 in 1938 and going up to the mid-50s. What I talked about before that was pre-comic book. And for technicalities and just for the sake of being complete, there also is what's known as the Platinum Age and the Victorian Age, and that's really what I combined before I started with the Golden Age. I just didn't really want to make things complicated, but overall those are, arguably different ages of comic books because they aren't the comic books that we know of today. And then one other short note, there is one other small division that they've added, and it's actually very appropriate, and I'm going to add it right here. So that's called the Dark Age. Now, the Dark Age was from the 1980s, somewhere in the 80s, until about 2000. The reason this was added in is due to the fact that you had an extreme change in mainstream comics and even some independent comics at that point, where from the 80s to about 2000, the turn of the century, a very, very big amount of comics got very dark and more violent and more vigilantism and more killing. And, these were the high points of characters like the Punisher and Spawn and the Vigilante, and just basically Wolverine was extremely, huge character. This is when he really came to popularity, and many others. It's just a differentiation there that kind of shows a trend that did definitely go on with comic books for quite some time. Now, there are still some very dark comics, there's still some very violent comics, so, it's all they're really trying to do is make the ages a little bit more specific and, have a little bit more of clarification as to what you were going to find. That being said, that doesn't mean that through the 80s to 2000 there weren't very, very different comic books. It's not like they were all violent and dark and more of a brooding atmosphere. So that was just a clarification. Now on to part 2 and the rest of the video. And so what I was getting at with storing your comic books, one thing that you want to do, whether you enjoy them or you want to sell them, either way, definitely get cardboard backings and bags, and make sure that they are the right size. The last thing that you want to do is try to stuff Golden Age or Silver Age or even some Bronze Age comic books into a modern age comic book bag and board. You will warp them and you will ruin their quality and their value. So just so you know, you can look it up very easily, but I'll put a couple of the brands up here. There are Golden Age, Silver Age, Bronze. Basically, the Silver Age, you can put the Bronze Age comic books into. They fit in those perfectly. And then there's the Modern Age, Current Age comic book boards and backs. Now, this is just me personally. I use Silver Age for all of my comic books, regardless of whether they're new or old, other than obviously Golden Age, which didn't fit. And I don't have too many Golden Age comic books. I wish I did. Because at this time, if you have Golden Age comic books, especially in good condition, you're talking about incredible amounts of money, depending on who they are and what hero it is. I'm sure I don't have to tell everyone that, Action Comics #1, 1938, first appearance of Superman, and Zatanna's father for that matter, that's gone for over $1 million in auction. And they do have one, I believe, in the Smithsonian, as well as Detective Comics #27, first appearance of Batman. And again, over $1 million. It's in the Smithsonian. So with all of the movies and the popularity in pop culture here now, basically just make sure if you get a hold of Golden Age comics that you hold on to them. Excuse me. All right, so moving on. So that's definitely for storage. Okay, that's what I was talking about as far as make sure that you have them in the proper size bags. And beyond that, basically there are the cardboard long boxes and the short boxes, which make sure that the comic books are bagged and boarded. I use 2 pieces of tape on the side of the flap of the comic book bag, and be very careful when you're doing that. Insert the comic book first, because if you get them stuck on the pieces of tape, you're going to cause some damage, and that is what you do not want to do. So with that said, the comic book boxes, there are the short ones right here, and then there are the long ones. I will also put that right here. That depends on what you have for storage in your home, or if you have a storage unit, or you have a barn or a shed or whatever. My storage is a problem right now. I'll leave it at that. I have too many comic books. But that being said, as a personal preference, I hate the long boxes. They are, once they're filled with comic books, whether you are bagging and boarding them or not, which please bag and board them, you really need to do that if you really care about having them stay in pristine condition. They're too heavy. I mean, they're back-breaking, they're horrible to move, and, if that's all you can do, that's fine. But there are several other methods of storage. One of my favorite methods of storage, and unfortunately this is extremely costly, but I've found some really good deals. They unfortunately have stopped making some of the plain ones, but they're comic book binders, and I'll put a picture up here. And basically they're like a binder that you open up, and you can slip in about, I think with bags and boards, 10 to 12 comic books. Now, it's ridiculous depending on the size of your collection. That's how I like to store them. And I'll show you a couple pictures of what I've done, where I will, they have plain fronts, and then as far as the edge of the thing, that's almost like a book edge, is exactly like a book edge.
Slow it down.
Yes,
Super dork.
I know. I'm talking too fast, so I'm going to slow down a little bit. So the book edge is where, I inserted, which comic books were in there, what issue numbers, and then did some graphics I just printed up on the page. So it's a nice way to store them if you have shelves. But again, this is not the most, inexpensive way to do it. So that's for very specific stuff. Like, I keep some of my most favorite things there, and it just makes it easier to get to. Comic book boxes can also be, if it depends on the amount of comic books you have, of course. So before I get off subject here anymore. Before I get off subject here anymore, so we don't have to have anybody doing any funny editings there.
That's just too easy.
Yeah, I opened myself up to that one. So there are definitely bookshelves that are specifically made for the storage of comic books. They range in, $100 and something, $700, they're very, very diverse. So again, this depends on how much you're willing to put into it and what you want to do with it. Okay, so... All right, well, that concludes part 2 of my 3-part series on comic book collecting for beginners. Obviously, the part 2 really concentrated on storage and the best way to store your comic books so you can keep them safe, whether you want to sell them or eventually, or if you are collecting them. Part 3 is going to concentrate on a few strategies of what I can give you a couple ideas of how to resell comic books if you think that's what you're going to try to do, and then just sum up the video from there and talk a little bit more about collecting in general. So thank you everybody for that. I will see you in part 3. Make sure you check out part 1 as well, that you can find on my page. So visit Rogue Logic. And of course, if you could, definitely like the video, and please put some comments below if you have any questions. I'd like to interact with you. And subscribe to the channel. It helps greatly, and I really would appreciate it. And hit notifications so you know when I have new content. With that, be kind, everyone, whenever you can, which is almost all the time. Please be kind to animals. We love them so much, and they give us so much. Peace, everybody.
Excuse me, do you know where the House of Mystery is?
I don't talk to strangers. I don't want to end up dead, man.